Old Frank Weld faces his days in growing solitude, living in an isolated country house while struggling with mental disorders that are gradually worsening. Frank's nights are filled with a strange form of entertainment. He ventures to rob his own house, creating a distraction for his restless mind. One day, after attempting to tidy up the disorganized space, he prepares to enjoy his breakfast, only to discover that the milk has already soured. Frustrated, he abandons the idea of having coffee and settles on the couch, drifting into a nap. In the middle of his rest, the phone rings. It's his daughter, Madison, who is in a distant country with a different culture and time zone. The conversation is interrupted by connection issues, leaving words unsaid hanging in the air. Later, Frank decides to leave his refuge and visits the city, where he heads to the last library that still houses physical books. There, he is warmly welcomed by Jennifer, the librarian, who values the presence of one of the rare readers who still appreciates the touch of paper. She shares with Frank some troubling news. A non-profit organization plans to completely digitize the collection, turning the place into a virtual library. While processing this impending change, Frank receives another call, this time from his son Hunter. In a hurry, he leaves the library and along the way enters a local store. The atmosphere shifts when the clerk treats him coldly, suspicious that the old man may have committed petty thefts before. Frank, ignoring the woman's veiled accusations, continues his way back home. Upon arriving, he finds Hunter waiting in his car, visibly concerned about his father's well-being. Hunter visits regularly, despite the distance, and is shocked by the chaos he finds. He expresses his desire for Frank to agree to live in a specialized care facility, but the father firmly resists the idea of leaving his home. In a gesture of concern, Hunter reveals an assistant robot he bought to help with daily tasks. Frank, a critic of automation, doesn't seem to like it at all. However, Hunter activates the robot, which promptly begins cleaning the house and preparing lunch. The two sit down to eat, and Frank tries to appeal to his son's emotions, mentioning that his mother would disapprove of such technological dependence. However, Hunter reminds his father that they separated 3 decades ago. At that moment, the robot serves a cake it prepared, trying to convince Frank of its usefulness. The next day, the robot takes over the household management, imposing a routine. It prepares nutritious meals, suggests outdoor activities, and even takes care of Frank's appearance. When the old man protests, claiming he doesn't need such assistance, the robot warns that without his acceptance, it will be deactivated and sent to storage. Faced with this prospect, Frank finds himself forced to reconsider his stance. On a sunny morning, Frank and his robot assistant decide to take a walk to the library. With a hint of mischief, Frank asks the robot to wait outside while he ventures into the interior, filled with ancient knowledge. Inside, Jennifer introduces Frank to Jake, the new owner of the place, who shows him a cabinet full of old books that are soon to be discarded. Frank's sadness is palpable. To him, each book holds a unique story. Meanwhile, outside, a group of boys begins to mock the robot, testing its limits with taunts. When Frank returns and notices his metal partner's discomfort, he gives him an unusual piece of advice. Next time, to scare away the bullies, the robot could pretend to start a countdown to self-destruction. The robot, ever analytical, processes the suggestion with curiosity. Back in town, they stop at a store where Frank, driven by an old impulse, steals another miniature. But this time, the clerk catches him in the act and confronts him. With the skill of an old trickster, Frank deftly returns the object without her noticing, but the clerk still lets him leave, albeit with suspicions. Later, to his surprise, Frank discovers the miniature inside the robot's bag, which, ever observant, decided to act on its own, mistakenly understanding its owner's needs. Frank finds himself in the position of explaining the concept of theft to the robot and, on impulse, begins teaching it how to pick locks. He then reveals his past as a jewelry expert, a criminal career that led him to prison twice, justifying that it was always the insurance companies who paid the price. Excited by the robot's natural skill for the task, Frank envisions a new horizon of possibilities. He takes the robot back to the library and carefully shows it the locations of the security cameras. Inside, he introduces the robot to Jennifer, who, unaware of the duo's nighttime plans, warmly invites them to the library's digital conversion party. At dusk, after a call from Hunter complaining about Madison's pressure to take back the robot, Frank decides it's time to act. They return to the library and skillfully dodge the cameras to steal a valuable old edition of Don Quixote. However, in the heat of the moment, Frank forgets his glasses while examining the book under the dim light. The next morning on the phone, Madison expresses surprise to hear that Frank has adapted well to the robot, but becomes frustrated when he hints that at least Hunter did something for him. The night promises more excitement as Frank prepares for the library party with Jennifer, which has now turned into a vibrant community center. There, she reveals that they already know about the theft, and that Jake suspects the motives of the thieves may be linked to the new sponsors of the digital project. As the night progresses at the library's digital conversion party, Frank's interaction with others is punctuated by an unexpected revelation. Jake, the library owner, introduces his wife to the couple, and soon pulls Jennifer aside for a more private conversation. With Jennifer away, Frank takes the opportunity to discreetly observe the jewelry adorning the guests, focusing especially on the dazzling necklace worn by Jake's wife. However, Jake himself soon approaches Frank with a serious expression. He confides that he is aware of Frank's past as a jewel thief and mentions the glasses Frank left behind in the library, asking him to stay away from now on. Surprised by the confrontation, Frank is even more disoriented when Jennifer returns, and in a moment of impulse, he accuses Jake of being a fraud, causing confusion for his friend. Back in the tranquility of his home, Frank finds an opportunity to assess Jake's wife's jewelry in more detail, thanks to the robot's visual memory. Noticing the gleam in Frank's eyes at the prospect of a new theft, the robot expresses concern, trying to dissuade the old thief from getting into more trouble. However, Frank argues that planning crimes sharpens his mind, and thus they begin observing Jake's house from a distance. During this surveillance, the robot makes a surprising revelation. It lied about the possibility of having its memory wiped. Touched by the robot's dedication to his safety, Frank asks that it never remind him that it's not alive. Frank's plans for a new heist are interrupted when Jennifer shows up at his door. Fearing she might discover his intentions, Frank refuses to let her in, leading her to leave, but not without offering a pie as a token of friendship. The next day, while attempting to return the stolen book, the music playing causes Frank to hesitate, and he decides to walk away. Meanwhile, his surveillance of Jake's house becomes a solitary activity as his daughter Madison returns from her trip, determined to get rid of the robot, deeming its presence ethically questionable. Ignoring Frank's protests, she deactivates the machine using a password unknown to her father and tries to distract him with photographs from her trip. The absence of the robot leaves a void in Frank's routine, as he deeply misses the interactions and care provided by his mechanical companion. The return to normalcy is rough for Frank. Without the robot to prepare his healthy breakfasts, he finds only cereal in the kitchen. His daughter, trying to please him, makes lasagna, but the dish doesn't taste the same without the robot's presence. Desperate, Frank asks Madison to reactivate the robot, but she refuses, leaving him at the mercy of his own nostalgia and the growing mess around him. The morning after the mess, Frank confronts Madison about the disarray. In his eyes, she failed to maintain the house as the robot easily would have. However, upon waking the next morning, Frank is surprised to find the house immaculate, as if by magic. He soon discovers that Madison had simply reactivated the robot. Indignant, Frank reiterates that the robot is not a mere appliance to be used at someone's convenience, sparking a conversation about the dignity of his mechanical companion. Madison reluctantly agrees to keep the robot active, acknowledging the complexity of the situation. With the house in order, Frank confides in the robot about his plan for that night. He details how the jewels actually belong to Jake's wife, and how Jake is nothing more than an opportunist. He plans to take advantage of the couple's frequent nighttime outings to carry out the heist. With his expertise, Frank has already mapped out dozens of escape routes and knows exactly where the security control panel of their house is located. Under the cover of night, the duo enters the residence. The robot, with its superior strength and speed, quickly accesses the safe, cracking the combination. They manage to steal the jewels, and despite an early return by the homeowners, they escape unseen. The next day, while the robot serves cocktails, the sheriff arrives with Jake, who is convinced that Frank is responsible for the recent robbery. The sheriff, already familiar with Frank's past, wants to search the house. Madison defends her father, though she is internally conflicted. After the tense visit, Madison prepares to leave. Before she goes, Frank hands her a pair of antique earrings, advising her to sell them far from there, a suggestion she accepts with a newfound understanding of the robot's usefulness. Shortly afterward, Frank notices a van strategically parked, observing his house, making him suspect that his home might be under surveillance. He quickly turns up the volume on the television to drown out any suspicious sounds and begins burning all his robbery plans in the fireplace. The robot, sensing the gravity of the situation, warns Frank about the risk his memory could pose if the police decide to investigate further. It suggests that Frank erase its memory to protect both of them. Frank, however, hesitates deeply, reluctant to erase the memories of his partner. In a moment of desperation, he asks the robot to contact Hunter, faking an emergency by saying he's dying, hoping to divert the authorities' attention and buy time to resolve the situation. When the alarming message reaches Hunter, he doesn't hesitate and rushes to his father's house, finding Frank seemingly frail and lying in bed. Worried, Hunter insists on taking him to the hospital, but in this vulnerable moment, Frank, confronted by his past and the looming truth being exposed, confesses to having been an absent father and asks for his son's forgiveness. In a gesture of trust, he begs Hunter to hide a suitcase without looking inside. Still confused but determined to help, Hunter places the suitcase in the trunk of his car. As Hunter is about to leave, the sheriff, who had been watching from a van, approaches him and insists on checking the suitcase. To everyone's surprise, it contains only a porcelain figurine, apparently worthless. The sheriff takes the opportunity to inform Hunter about the recent neighborhood robbery, placing Frank under suspicion. Confused and frustrated, Hunter questions the accusation, especially given his father's debilitated state. Meanwhile, Frank, watching the situation unfold from the porch, casually steps into the scene, only adding to Hunter's frustration, as he had been pushed to his limit by the urgency of the call. The tension rises when Jake suggests that the robot's memory could be checked to confirm any involvement of Frank in the crime. The police then turn to the robot, which, in a dramatic moment, announces that its self-destruct system has been activated, starting a countdown. Taking advantage of the distraction caused by the robot's threat, Frank escapes in Hunter's car, taking the robot with him. During the escape, the robot once again asks Frank to erase its memory to avoid future problems. They find temporary refuge in the library, where Frank opens up to Jennifer about the tumultuous events. It is there that Frank, observing photos on the wall, sees one of himself with Jennifer, and surprisingly, recognizes her as his wife, a memory lost due to his illness. Returning home discreetly, the robot insists one last time that Frank erase its memory, arguing that they could start over and even plan new heists. Moved by the argument, Frank regretfully turns the robot off. Time passes, and Frank's dementia worsens, leading him to an adult care facility. There, he receives visits from his family, where despite his failing memory, he feels loved and cared for. During one of these visits, he discreetly passes a note to Hunter, hinting that the stolen jewelry is buried under the tomatoes in the garden tended by the robot. In summary, the film is a provocative reflection on old age, the ethics of technology, and personal redemption, a narrative that challenges the traditional genre, making it worthwhile for those looking for something that defies expectations and provokes thought. If you enjoyed this film, then I recommend watching this other one here as well. I guarantee you'll like it. See you there.